the autumn wind screamed through the corn rows like the dying breath of Yiska's murdered wife, each gust carrying memories that had haunted him for 3 long years. October 1881 had brought an early frost to the Snake River country outside Diamond Creek, Idaho territory, and the golden stalks swayed in a violent dance that whispered of coming winter and unfinished vengeance. The corn stood ready for harvest, heavy ears promising survival for those brave enough to claim them. But Yiska knelt among the furrows, with the weight of loss pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. At 30, he bore the scars of a dozen conflicts, each one etched into his flesh and soul, with the precision of a master craftsman working in pain. The most prominent was the jagged white line that ran from his left knee to his ankle, a permanent reminder of the cavalry charge that had scattered his family like leaves before a prairie fire. He had been drawing the soldiers away from the winter camp, where his pregnant wife Ayanna lay sick with the white man's fever, leading the bluecoats on a desperate chase through 3 counties, while women and children fled into the Badlands with whatever they could carry. The bullet had shattered bone and torn muscle, sending him tumbling from his horse into a ravine, where he lay bleeding and delirious for 2 days. When he finally crawled back to the camp, he found only ashes and unmarked graves. Ayanna was dead, claimed by fever and childbirth complications, while he played decoy for soldiers who had burned the lodges anyway. Their son, a boy he had never seen. Draw Breath lay beside her in the frozen ground, another casualty of the endless war between red and white that had defined his adult life. The memory of that discovery still woke him in the dark hours before dawn, still made his hands shake when he thought too long about justice and revenge. But 3 years of careful diplomacy and forced peace had taught him to channel that rage into something more useful than blind violence. His role as mediator between his people and the scattered white settlers required him to navigate both worlds with the careful precision of a man walking on thin ice over a raging river. His leather shirt, decorated with porcupine quills and the geometric patterns that told his lineage back 7 generations, marked him as Shoshone. But his knowledge of English and territorial law made him valuable to both sides in the endless disputes over land and water rights that plagued the frontier. The carved bone handle of his grandfather's war knife pressed against his ribs, a weapon that had drawn blood in defense of his people during the treaty wars, but now served as a reminder of responsibilities that extended beyond personal grief. A sound made him freeze in place, the soft whisper of someone trying not to breathe too loudly, followed by the barely audible rustle of fabric against cornstalks. His warrior's training kicked in, automatically cataloging the direction and distance of the disturbance, while his hand moved instinctively toward his knife. But he forced himself to remain still, watching and waiting, as his grandfather had taught him during the long winters when survival depended on patience more than courage. Across the row, perhaps 20 feet away, a figure emerged from the golden maze like a specter materialized from desperation itself. She was young, no more than 20, with dirt streaked across pale cheeks and hunger carved into the sharp angles of her face, like script written in suffering. Her dress, once blue calico, had faded to the color of old bruises, and her hands trembled as she clutched 2 ears of corn against her chest, as if they were made of precious metal rather than simple grain. But there was something in her eyes that gave Yiska pause, a flicker of intelligence that seemed at odds with her desperate circumstances, as though she possessed knowledge that went far beyond the simple needs of survival. She moved through the corn with a familiarity that suggested previous visits, and her gaze swept the field with the systematic attention of someone looking for specific things rather than simply scavenging for food. Yiska remained motionless, studying her with the same careful attention he would give to tracking a wounded animal through dangerous terrain. She was dangerous, not because she posed a physical threat to him, but because her presence here was clearly part of some larger pattern that he did not yet understand. In his experience, young white women did not venture alone into disputed territory unless they were driven by forces more powerful than simple hunger. Her eyes wide with fear and something deeper shame perhaps, or the soul-deep exhaustion that came from carrying secrets too heavy for one person to bear, met his across the corn rows. For a moment, neither moved, each taking the measure of the other in that peculiar frontier arithmetic that calculated threat and opportunity in the space of a heartbeat. She was evaluating him just as carefully as he was evaluating her. And there was calculation in her gaze that spoke of experience with dangerous men and difficult choices. "I'm hungry." She whispered the words, carrying across the autumn air like a prayer offered to an uncertain God. The simple declaration hit Yiska like a physical blow, awakening memories of his own hungry winters after the cavalry had driven his band from their traditional hunting grounds and left them to survive on government rations that never came. He remembered Ayanna growing thin during her pregnancy, her body weakening from lack of proper food, while he ranged farther and farther from camp, in desperate search of game that the white hunters had already decimated. When the fever came, she had been too weak to fight it, and their son had never had a chance to draw his first breath in a world that seemed determined to deny life to anyone with red skin. The woman's collarbone stood out sharp beneath translucent skin, and her dress hung loose where it should have curved with the promise of womanhood. She had been surviving on scraps and hope for too long, but there was something calculated about her desperation, as though she had chosen this particular field for reasons that went beyond simple opportunity. The way she held herself, the direction of her gaze, even the timing of her appearance, all of it suggested planning rather than chance. Without breaking eye contact, Yiska selected several of the finest ears from the pile beside him and extended them toward her, his palm open and steady. The gesture was both offer and test. If she was truly desperate, she would take the corn gratefully and disappear. If she was here for other reasons, she would reveal more of her true purpose. "Take them," he said simply, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to making decisions that affected other people's lives. The woman's breathing quickened, and for a moment he thought she might bolt like a startled deer. But instead of reaching for the corn, her gaze darted past his shoulder, with the kind of focused attention that suggested she had been expecting company. A fraction of a second later, he caught the sound that had alerted her, the distinctive metallic click of a rifle being cocked, followed by the creak of leather and the snort of horses held in check. "Well, well," a voice drawled from beyond the fence line, carrying the lazy menace of a snake coiled to strike. "Looks like we caught ourselves a real touching reunion here. Indian brave playing hero to a runaway whore." Yiska shifted smoothly, placing his shoulder between the woman and the source of the voice, while his mind raced through tactical calculations. His hand moved instinctively toward his knife, then stopped drawing. Steel would escalate this situation beyond any hope of peaceful resolution, and he was almost certainly outnumbered by men who had been waiting for exactly this kind of provocation. The wooden gate at the field's edge exploded inward with a crash that sent crows erupting from nearby cottonwoods in a black cloud of panic and rage. 3 riders entered with the casual arrogance of men who had never learned to doubt their own authority. Lucky Pete Morrison, foreman of the Double R Ranch, flanked by 2 of his most trusted guns. Pete earned his nickname not from good fortune, but from his habit of carrying marked cards and using them to fleece anyone foolish enough to trust him at a poker table. He was lean as a whip and twice as vicious, with pale blue eyes that missed nothing and a smile that never reached beyond his lips. The men with him were cut from similar cloth-hard cases, who earned their pay as much with violence as with any skill at handling cattle or managing ranch operations. "Caught ourselves a thief, Yiska," Pete said, swinging down from his horse with practiced ease. His boots hit the ground with authority, and his hand rested casually on the butt of his Colt revolver in a gesture that was both threat and promise. "And here I was thinking you people had finally learned to understand property rights," The racial slur was delivered with casual malice, designed to provoke a reaction that would justify whatever violence Pete had planned from the moment he decided to follow the woman to this field. Yiska had heard such words countless times in cavalry camps, where officers spoke casually of clearing the land of its indigenous inhabitants, in town saloons, where drunken cowboys bragged about their exploits in Indian hunting, in territorial courtrooms where justice was a commodity sold to the highest bidder without regard for truth or fairness. But he had learned to let such words pass through him, like wind through grass, saving his energy for battles that could actually be won, rather than wasting it on momentary satisfactions that would solve nothing. His wife's death had taught him that rage without purpose was just another form of suicide, and he had too much work left to do to indulge in the luxury of righteous anger. This is community ground. Yiska replied, his voice steady despite the fire that burned in his chest like banked coals. Planted by formal agreement between Paul Hendricks and my band. She's taken nothing that wasn't freely offered under the terms of that arrangement. Pete's laugh held no humor, only the sharp edge of a man who enjoyed inflicting humiliation on those he considered beneath his notice. See, that's where you're wrong, friend. This little lady here belongs to me. He pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket and waved it like a battle flag, his movements theatrical and calculated for maximum psychological impact. Got the contract right here, witnessed proper at Harry's land office just yesterday. She ran out on a law-binding indenture agreement, and I aim to collect what's owed according to the terms we agreed upon. The woman Cora, he remembered now having glimpsed her occasionally around Diamond Creek, doing odd jobs for anyone willing to pay a few cents for manual labor, went rigid as if struck by lightning. Her face went pale beneath the dirt and grime, but there was something in her expression that went beyond simple fear. There was recognition there, and knowledge, and a kind of desperate calculation that suggested she understood far more about her situation than a simple runaway servant should. I signed for kitchen and sewing work. She said, her voice flat with terror that ran bone deep, but was controlled by an effort of will that impressed Yiska despite the circumstances. Honest work at honest wages, nothing more. When I got to the ranch, you made it abundantly clear that you expected additional services. I left rather than submit to such degradation. Something flickered in her eyes as she spoke, a momentary glance toward Pete that carried the weight of shared secrets and mutual knowledge. There was history between these two that went beyond simple employment disputes, and Yiska filed that observation away for later consideration, while he focused on the immediate tactical situation. Pete's face darkened like storm clouds, gathering over the mountains, his pale eyes narrowing with the kind of cold rage that preceded serious violence. That's a damned lie, and you know it, girl. I never laid an improper hand on you, never asked for anything beyond the services specifically outlined in your contract. You're just trying to wriggle out of honest obligation because the work turned out to be harder than your delicate sensibilities could handle. But there was something forced about his denial, something that rang false even to Yiska's ears. Pete was a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and violence, not someone who typically bothered with elaborate justifications for his actions. The fact that he was working so hard to establish his version of events suggested that there were witnesses he cared about convincing or higher authorities he needed to satisfy. If she's truly your indentured servant, Yiska said quietly, his words cutting through the rising tension like a blade through cloth. Why does your signature appear as both the contracting party and the legal witness to her agreement? The observation hit like a thunderbolt striking a tree during a summer storm. Pete's confidence wavered for just an instant, long enough for Yiska to catch the flicker of uncertainty in his pale eyes and the almost imperceptible tensing of his shoulders that suggested a man whose carefully laid plans had just encountered an unexpected obstacle. There was something fundamentally wrong with that contract, something that went far beyond simple clerical irregularities or bureaucratic oversight. In Yiska's experience with territorial paperwork, such documents required independent witnesses specifically to prevent the kind of conflict of interest that Pete's dual signatures represented. The fact that he had been careless enough to make such an obvious mistake suggested either arrogance or desperation, possibly both. "Now see here." Pete began, his voice rising with manufactured indignation. But his words were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, quick and purposeful, coming from the direction of the main road. Dr. Elias Whitmore hurried toward them with his black medical bag bouncing against his hip, his face flushed with exertion and what appeared to be genuine concern for the developing confrontation. The doctor was a small man in his 50s, with gray whiskers and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles that had seen too much suffering during his years of frontier practice. He had arrived in Diamond Creek 3 years ago with impressive credentials and a mysterious reluctance to discuss his previous practice in Denver, establishing himself as one of the few medical professionals willing to treat patients regardless of their ability to pay or the color of their skin. But as he approached the tense scene at the cornfield, Yiska noticed something that struck him as odd. There was a tightness around the doctor's eyes that suggested more than simple concern for a potential medical emergency. Dr. Elias moved with the purposeful stride of a man who had been expecting trouble rather than someone who had stumbled upon it accidentally, and his gaze kept flickering toward Cora with an expression that mixed concern with something that might have been guilt or recognition. "By thunder, Doctor." Elias called out slightly out of breath from his rapid walk. "What's all this commotion about?" But there was something forced about his surprise, as though he had been rehearsing the words during his approach and was now delivering them with less conviction than he had intended. Pete's smile returned with renewed confidence, showing teeth stained with tobacco and something darker. "No commotion at all, Doc? Just collecting what's rightfully mine, according to the law of this territory." He held up the contract again, this time with theatrical flourish designed to impress the new arrival. "Legal and proper, witnessed and sealed with all the appropriate territorial markings." As Dr. Elias took the document and began examining it with the careful attention of an educated man, Yiska caught him exchanging a meaningful glance with Cora, brief but significant enough to confirm his growing suspicion that there were connections between these people that went far beyond their apparent roles in this confrontation. There was recognition in that glance, and something that might have been guilt or fear or both. The pieces of a larger puzzle were beginning to form in Yiska's mind, though their complete shape remained frustratingly unclear. A runaway servant who knew too much about legal documents, a doctor who seemed to expect trouble, a foreman who was working unusually hard to establish his legal authority, and a contract that bore obvious signs of irregular preparation. All of it suggested coordination and planning that extended far beyond a simple employment dispute. "This appears to be technically in order, Doctor," Elias said slowly, his words chosen with the careful precision of a man walking through a minefield of legal and ethical complications. But his tone carried undertones of reluctance and reservation that suggested he saw the same irregularities that Yiska had noticed. However, such matters involving questions of personal liberty are usually handled through proper legal channels rather than direct confrontation. Perhaps we should take this matter to Sheriff Carson and allow him to determine the appropriate course of action. It was a diplomatic solution that offered everyone a chance to step back from immediate violence while preserving face and legal standing for all parties involved. But as the suggestion hung in the air, Yiska noticed that Pete's confidence seemed to increase rather than diminish, as though the prospect of involving Sheriff Carson was exactly what he had been hoping for, rather than an obstacle to his plans. "Excellent suggestion, Doc. Pete said with obvious satisfaction. I'm sure Sheriff Carson will be happy to enforce the territorial law regarding contract obligations. After all, we can't have people thinking they can just walk away from legal agreements whenever the work gets difficult. The small procession that made its way toward Diamond Creek was a study in contrasts and hidden tensions. Pete and his men rode with the casual arrogance of those who expected the law to support their position, while Yiska, Dr. Elias, and Cora walked in the dust of their horses, an arrangement that spoke volumes about the power dynamics at play in their small frontier community. But Yiska noticed that Cora kept glancing at Dr. Elias with an expression that mixed hope with something that might have been desperation, while the doctor himself seemed increasingly uncomfortable as they approached the town. There were undercurrents here that went far beyond the surface drama of a contract dispute, and Yiska's warrior instincts warned him that they were walking into a situation that had been carefully orchestrated by people with agendas that remained hidden. Diamond Creek sprawled before them like a collection of children's blocks scattered by a careless hand, unpainted buildings that had weathered too many harsh winters, muddy streets that turned to dust in summer and freezing mud in winter, and the constant sense that everything was temporary, that a strong wind or a bad economic season might blow it all away and leave nothing but grass and sky. It was a hard place populated by hard people, and Yiska had learned to navigate its social and political currents with the same careful attention he gave to tracking dangerous animals through unfamiliar terrain. The sheriff's office occupied a corner of Main Street sharing space with the jail and a small courtroom that doubled as a meeting hall when the circuit judge made his infrequent appearances. It was a cramped, functional space that smelled of tobacco smoke leather and the peculiar mixture of fear and resignation that seemed to permeate all frontier law enforcement facilities. Sheriff William Carson, known to most locals as Quiet Will for his reluctance to speak unless absolutely necessary, looked up from his desk as they entered. His weathered face showed resignation rather than surprise, the expression of a man who had learned that trouble was as predictable as sunrise in a place like Diamond Creek. But there was something else in his demeanor that caught Yiska's attention, a kind of nervous energy that suggested he had been expecting this confrontation rather than being caught off guard by it. Williams was past 50 with gray threading through his mustache and the look of someone who had seen enough violence to recognize when it was brewing like storm clouds on the horizon. He had served as sheriff for nearly 5 years, maintaining order through a combination of diplomatic skill and strategic use of force. But there were whispers around town that his methods had become increasingly compromised by political pressures and financial difficulties that made him vulnerable to outside influence. Hatchet Harry Crosley rose from a chair beside the sheriff's desk, his presence explaining Pete's confidence in the outcome of this legal proceeding. Harry earned his nickname from his practice of cutting through red tape in his role as Diamond Creek's land agent, though most locals suspected his methods involved creating more problems than he solved. He was a small man with outsized ambitions, dressed in a town suit that suggested prosperity he didn't quite possess. But his presence in the sheriff's office at this particular moment was clearly not coincidental. As Harry produced the contract with theatrical flourish, Yiska noticed that his hands were trembling slightly, not with age or infirmity, but with what looked suspiciously like nervous excitement or fear. There was something about the land agent's demeanor that suggested a man operating under significant pressure, someone who had staked everything on the outcome of this particular legal maneuver. "Gentlemen, we have here a simple case of breach of contract," Harry declared, his voice carrying a forced joviality that didn't quite mask an underlying nervousness. Miss Cora Whitfield signed a binding agreement for domestic service with Mr. Morrison, properly witnessed and executed according to territorial law. She then absconded from her obligations, taking with her valuable property in the form of unpaid labor and advance wages. Sheriff Carson examined the document with unusual care, his finger tracing the signature lines, while his face grew increasingly troubled. There was something about his examination that went beyond normal bureaucratic thoroughness. He was looking for specific things, checking particular details with the attention of someone who knew what irregularities to expect. "Contract looks unusual in some respects," he said finally, his words chosen with obvious care. "Miss Whitfield, you have the legal right to present your side of this matter before any enforcement action is taken." But as William spoke, Yiska caught him glancing toward the window with the kind of nervous attention that suggested he was expecting someone or something that had not yet arrived. The sheriff's behavior, combined with the odd reactions from Dr. Elias and the tremor in Harry's hands, painted a picture of men operating under pressures that went far beyond simple legal proceedings. It was becoming clear that this confrontation had been planned in advance, with multiple parties playing roles that had been assigned to them by someone else. The question was, who was directing this particular drama, and what they hoped to accomplish beyond simply recovering a runaway servant. Cora stepped forward with her chin raised, despite her obvious fear. And when she spoke, her voice carried a strength that surprised everyone in the room. "I signed a contract for honest kitchen work at honest wages, Sheriff Carson. Nothing more and nothing less. When I arrived at Mr. Morrison's ranch, he made his true expectations abundantly clear, and they went far beyond any domestic services that could be considered legal or moral." She paused, and Yiska caught that flicker of calculation in her eyes again and the look of someone who possessed information that could change the direction of this entire confrontation. "But there's something else this court should know. I've had experience with clerical work in my previous employment, and I can tell you that this contract lacks several elements that are mandatory for legitimate territorial documents." The revelation that she possessed clerical experience seemed to surprise everyone except Dr. Elias, who closed his eyes briefly as though he had been dreading this particular moment. Pete's face went pale beneath his weathered tan, while Harry began shuffling through papers on the sheriff's desk with obvious agitation that suggested Cora's knowledge was more dangerous to their plans than they had anticipated. "Maureen's, where exactly did you acquire this clerical experience?" Sheriff Carson asked, his voice carrying new interest that suggested he was beginning to understand that this case involved more than simple contract enforcement. Cora hesitated, glancing again at Dr. Elias before answering with the deliberate precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly this question. "At the English mining operation in Bronze Canyon, Sheriff. I kept detailed records for their administrative activities over a period of several months." The admission hit the room like a thunderclap, transforming the atmosphere from tense to electric in the space of a single sentence. Suddenly, everyone was looking at everyone else with new suspicion and understanding, while pieces of a much larger puzzle began falling into place with disturbing clarity. Dr. Elias sank into a chair as though his legs would no longer support him, his face going ashen with what looked like a combination of fear and resignation. Harry's shuffling through papers became more frantic, while Pete's hand moved unconsciously toward his gun, in a gesture that suggested violence might become necessary sooner than he had planned. "What kind of records did you keep for the mining operation?" Yiska asked, his warrior's instincts telling him they were approaching the heart of whatever conspiracy had brought them all to this moment. "Land acquisition schedules," Cora replied, her voice growing stronger as she spoke, as though the act of revealing her secrets was liberating her from fears that had been eating at her for months. "Water rights transfers, mineral extraction permits, and detailed plans for public works improvements that would affect the entire Snake River Valley." She took a breath and looked directly at Sheriff Carson. "And falsified documentation designed to make illegal land seizures appear legitimate to territorial authorities who might investigate irregularities." Norderkas, the full scope of what she was revealing began to dawn on everyone in the room. This wasn't simply a matter of a runaway servant or even fraudulent employment contracts. They were looking at evidence of a massive conspiracy involving land fraud, document forgery, and probably corruption of territorial officials at the highest levels. Sheriff Carson set the contract on his desk and looked around the room with the expression of a man who suddenly understood that he was in far deeper waters than he had realized. His nervous glances toward the window took on new significance as Yiska began to suspect that the sheriff's loyalties might be more complicated than his badge would suggest. Miss Whitfield will remain in town custody until we can sort this matter out properly, William said, but his voice lacked the conviction that should have accompanied such an official decision. I'll need time to examine these allegations and determine what additional investigation might be warranted. As Cora was led to the single cell that served as Diamond Creek's jail, she managed to whisper to Yiska as she passed, "The dam, Mr. Yiska. They're planning something terrible with the dam. People need to know before it's too late." The warning sent a chill down Yiska's spine that had nothing to do with the autumn weather outside. Bronze Canyon was the site of the English mining operation Settling Pond, a massive earthen dam that held back thousands of tons of contaminated water and mining debris. If someone was planning to manipulate that structure for their own purposes, the consequences for everyone living downstream could be catastrophic. That evening, as storm clouds gathered over the Snake River Valley, and the first drops of cold rain began to fall, Yiska made his way to Paul Hendrick's modest farm to discuss what they had learned and plan their next moves. The farmer's homestead sat on a slight rise that provided a good view of the surrounding bottomland. And Yiska had noticed that Paul always seemed to know what was happening throughout the valley, days before anyone else. Paul met him at the door, with worry etched into every line of his weathered face. At 65, he was one of the older settlers in the Snake River country, having arrived with the first wave of farmers who believed they could coax crops from the semi-arid soil through determination, irrigation, and careful husbandry of limited resources. His farm was small, but well-maintained, with a neat cabin that spoke of Scandinavian heritage, a barn that had weathered many harsh seasons and fields that showed the kind of careful attention that separated successful farmers from those who ended up buried in unmarked graves beside failed homesteads. "Heard there was considerable excitement in town today," Paul said as they settled into chairs around his kitchen table. "Ruth's been worried sick ever since word reached us about the trouble at the Cornfield." Ruth Hendricks emerged from the pantry where she had been organizing supplies for the coming winter, wiping flour from her hands on a spotless apron. She was a small woman with prematurely gray hair and the kind of quiet strength that held frontier families together through seasons of plenty and years of want. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent despite her lack of formal education, took in the tension in Yiska's face and drew her own conclusions about the seriousness of their situation. But as Yiska looked around the Hendricks kitchen, something caught his attention that he had never noticed before. While every other farm in the valley had been complaining about dropping water levels in their irrigation ditches, the Hendricks well was still full to the brim, and their fields showed no signs of the stress that was affecting their neighbors. It was a small detail, but one that nagged at his warrior's instincts, even as he focused on the more immediate concerns they faced. "You'll be wanting coffee," Ruth said without preamble, moving to the stove with the efficiency of someone who had learned to anticipate needs before they were expressed. "And probably something stronger judging by the look of you." As they waited for the coffee to brew, Dr. Elias arrived with rain dripping from his coat and an expression that mixed exhaustion with something approaching desperation. The doctor had clearly been struggling with internal conflicts throughout the day, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had been carrying guilty secrets for far too long. "I need to tell you something," he said without preamble, his hands shaking as he removed his spectacles and cleaned them with trembling fingers. "Something I should have shared months ago, but I was too frightened and too ashamed to admit my complicity in what's been happening." He looked up at the assembled group with haunted eyes that reflected years of accumulated guilt and fear. 3 years ago, shortly after I established my practice here, I was approached by representatives of the English mining company. They wanted detailed medical records of everyone in the valley, birth certificates, death certificates, family histories, records of property ownership, and inheritance patterns. Paul's face darkened with understanding, but there was something in his expression that didn't quite match the surprise that should have accompanied such a revelation. They were mapping the community, identifying targets for their land acquisition scheme. They claimed it was for insurance purposes related to their mining operations. Dr. Elias continued, his voice barely above a whisper. They said they needed to understand the health risks and population roles and settlement ledgers that might affect their workforce and business planning. It seemed reasonable at the time, and they offered to pay handsomely for my cooperation. Ruth set down her coffee cup with a sharp click that seemed unusually loud in the sudden silence. But you gave them the information anyway, didn't you? Dr. Elias nodded miserably. They threatened to have my medical license revoked if I refused to cooperate. They claimed to have influence with territorial authorities, evidence of irregularities in my previous practice that could be used to destroy my reputation and livelihood. I was frightened and isolated, and I made the worst possible choice. What kind of irregularities? Yiska asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. I had been treating patients regardless of their race or ability to pay. Dr. Elias replied. In Denver, that was considered unprofessional conduct by the medical establishment. They had documented instances of me providing care to Chinese immigrants, Negro railroad workers, and indigenous people who were supposed to receive medical attention only through government agencies. The irony was bitter and obvious. Dr. Elias had been blackmailed into betraying his adopted community because of his history of treating all patients with equal compassion and skill. The mining company had used his virtues against him, turning his commitment to universal medical care into a weapon for their own corrupt purposes. How long have you been providing them with information? Paul asked. There was something in his tone that suggested more than casual interest in the doctor's answer. Nearly 3 years, Dr. Elias admitted. Every birth, every death, every family crisis or financial difficulty that came to my attention. I've been watching them use that information to target specific families, specific properties, always knowing that I was partially responsible for whatever suffering resulted from their schemes. And you never thought to warn anyone? Ruth asked, her voice carrying a sharp edge that was unusual for her normally gentle demeanor. Dr. Elias looked up with tears in his eyes. I was terrified of what they might do if I betrayed their trust. They made it clear that my cooperation was not optional, and that the consequences of defying them would extend beyond just my own professional destruction. As the conversation continued, Yiska found himself studying Paul's reactions with growing unease. The older farmer was asking all the right questions and expressing appropriate outrage at Dr. Elias's revelations, but there was something calculated about his responses, as though he was performing a role rather than experiencing genuine shock and anger. More disturbing was the fact that Paul had been the most insistent about taking their concerns to Sheriff Carson, despite the obvious risks involved in trusting local authorities with such sensitive information. And his farm remained mysteriously unaffected by the water shortages that were plaguing every other agricultural operation in the valley. The water levels in our irrigation ditches have been dropping for 2 weeks, Ruth said, changing the subject to more immediate practical concerns. Whatever they're doing upstream is getting progressively worse. Our crops are already suffering, and if this continues, we'll lose everything we've worked for. But even as she spoke, Yiska could see through the kitchen window that the Hendricks irrigation system was flowing at full capacity, with no signs of the restrictions that were forcing other farmers to choose between watering their crops and maintaining their livestock. Paul nodded with what appeared to be genuine concern. I've been checking the river levels every morning, and the pattern is too consistent to be natural. Someone is deliberately manipulating the water flow, probably to weaken the foundation of that earthen dam they've built to contain their mining waste. The pieces of their increasingly complex puzzle were falling into place with horrifying clarity. But now Yiska was beginning to suspect that some of those pieces might not be what they appeared to be. A mining company with detailed intelligence about every resident of the valley, a corrupt land agent manufacturing fraudulent contracts to justify land seizures, a sheriff whose loyalties were questionable at best, and now evidence of deliberate environmental sabotage that could result in catastrophic flooding. But there was also a farmer whose property remained mysteriously unaffected by the problems plaguing his neighbors, and who had been remarkably well informed about developments throughout the valley, despite his supposedly isolated position. If they're planning to breach that dam, Yiska said, his voice heavy with the implications while his mind worked through the tactical possibilities. They could wash away every farm in the valley and claim it was a natural disaster. Perfect cover for seizing the land they've been trying to acquire through fraudulent contracts. And anyone who knew the truth about their activities would be conveniently eliminated by the flood. Dr. Elias added his medical training, allowing him to appreciate the brutal efficiency of such a plan. Including Cora, who has seen their real documents and understands their actual objectives. Paul leaned forward with what appeared to be genuine urgency. Then we need to act tonight, before they have time to complete whatever they're planning. The dam needs to be examined, and if it's been sabotaged, we need to warn everyone downstream. There was something about his eagerness that set off alarm bells in Yiska's mind. Paul was right about the urgency of the situation, but his willingness to charge into danger seemed at odds with the careful, methodical approach that had characterized his farming practices over the years. The storm outside was intensifying, with wind-driven rain lashing against the cabin's windows and thunder rolling across the valley like artillery fire from some distant battlefield. But the weather was nothing compared to the human storm that was brewing around them, a conspiracy of greed and violence that threatened to destroy everything they had worked to build in this harsh but beautiful country. We need to see that dam for ourselves. Yiska said, his warrior's instincts demanding direct reconnaissance rather than speculation based on incomplete information. Tonight, before they have time to complete whatever they're planning. In this weather, Ruth asked, concern for their safety overriding her natural inclination to support whatever action might protect their community. Especially in this weather, Paul replied, understanding the tactical advantages that the storm would provide. They won't be expecting visitors, and the rain will cover our movements while we get close enough to see what they're really doing up there. Dr. Elias stood with obvious reluctance, his guilt driving him to participate despite his fear of the consequences. I know the layout of their facilities from my previous cooperation with their representatives. I can guide you to the observation points that will give us the best view of their operations. As they prepared for their nighttime reconnaissance mission, Yiska found himself thinking about Cora, locked in the town jail, probably unaware that her revelations had set in motion events that would determine the fate of everyone in the Snake River Valley. She had shown remarkable courage in speaking out, despite the obvious dangers, and he was determined not to let her sacrifice be wasted through inaction or cowardice on their part. But he was also increasingly troubled by the inconsistencies in Paul's behavior and the mysterious immunity of the Hendricks farm to the problems affecting their neighbors. In his experience, when things seemed too convenient or too coincidental, it usually meant that someone was manipulating events from behind the scenes. The ride to Bronze Canyon was treacherous in the storm, with driving rain that soaked through their heaviest coats and turned every creek crossing into a potential death trap. But the weather also provided perfect cover for their approach, masking the sound of their horses' hooves and reducing visibility to the point where they could move within a few hundred yards of the mining camp without being detected. What they found, when they finally reached their observation point, was worse than their most pessimistic expectations. The massive earthen dam that held back the mining company's settling pond was not merely failing, it was being systematically destroyed from within, with carefully placed charges and strategic excavation designed to create a catastrophic collapse that would appear to be the result of natural forces. But it was the timing of the sabotage that made Yiska's blood run cold. The dam was being prepared for immediate failure, with crews working through the storm to complete their preparations. If their calculations were correct, the structure would collapse within hours, sending millions of gallons of contaminated water roaring down the Snake River Valley, like the wrath of an angry god. The human drama unfolding in the mining camp's headquarters tent was equally disturbing. Through the rain-lashed canvas, they could see several figures gathered around what appeared to be a large map, their voices carrying occasional fragments of conversation that confirmed their worst fears about the scope and timing of the conspiracy. Federal authorities expect their justification for military intervention by dawn. One voice was saying its cultured accent, suggesting British origins. The territorial governor has already been briefed on the public works sabotage that will require immediate military response to prevent further damage by local insurgents. The girl represents our biggest remaining vulnerability, came another voice that Yiska recognized as Pete Morrison's. She's seen too much, knows too much about our real activities. We can't afford to leave her as a potential witness when the federal investigators arrive. Then we don't leave her, replied a third voice that made Yiska's heart sink. Sheriff Carson, speaking with an authority that had been completely absent during their confrontation at his office. The flood will solve all our problems simultaneously. Natural disaster, tragic loss of life, federal troops called in to restore order and protect the surviving mining assets from further sabotage attempts. But it was the fourth voice that shocked Yiska to his core. Paul Hendricks, speaking with the confident authority of someone who was clearly one of the conspiracy's planners rather than an innocent victim. My farm will serve as the evacuation staging area for the survivors, Paul was saying, his familiar voice now carrying undertones of greed and calculation that Yiska had never heard before. The water won't reach that high, and I can provide supplies and shelter for anyone who needs help after the disaster. It will establish my credibility as a community leader when the federal investigators arrive. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking in its cynical calculation and brutal efficiency. They were planning to murder an entire valley full of people to cover up their crimes and create justification for military occupation that would give them complete control over the region's water and mineral resources. It was genocide disguised as disaster relief, and it was being orchestrated by people that Yiska had trusted as friends and allies. Dr. Elias, crouched beside him in the rain-soaked observation post, was staring at the tent with an expression of absolute horror as the implications of what they were hearing began to sink in. "Paul," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of wind and rain. "Paul is one of them." The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound Yiska had ever received. Paul Hendricks had been more than just a farming partner. He had been a bridge between the white and indigenous communities, a man whose word could be trusted and whose judgment could be relied upon in times of crisis. To discover that he had been working with the mining company all along, providing them with intelligence and helping to orchestrate the destruction of his own neighbors, was like discovering that the ground beneath his feet was actually quicksand. "We have to get back to town." Yiska said, his voice tight with the effort of controlling his rage and focusing on tactical necessities. "Cora is in immediate danger, and we're the only ones who know the truth about what's really happening." But even as he spoke, he realized that their situation was far worse than simply being outnumbered by the conspirators. Paul knew all of their plans, all of their capabilities, and all of their likely responses to this crisis. More importantly, he had been guiding their decision-making process from the beginning, steering them toward choices that would serve the conspiracy's interests, rather than protecting the community. The ride back toward Diamond Creek was a nightmare of wind rain, and the growing realization that they were riding into a trap that had been prepared specifically for them. Paul rode beside them with the same concerned expression he had worn throughout their investigation, playing his role as the worried farmer right up until the moment when his true loyalties would be revealed. As they approached the outskirts of town, Yellowhawk materialized from the storm like an avenging spirit, his young face grim with news that confirmed their worst fears about the immediate danger they faced. "The dam is failing faster than they planned," he reported in a whisper that barely carried over the sound of wind and rain. "I've been watching from the North Ridge, and water is already seeping through the base in several places. The whole structure could collapse at any moment, whether they're ready or not." The information transformed their desperate situation into a race against time and natural forces that were beyond anyone's control. If the dam failed before they could warn the people downstream and evacuate Cora from the jail where she would certainly die, the mining company's plan would succeed through natural acceleration rather than human timing. "How long do we have?" Dr. Elias asked his medical training, making him focus on the practical requirements for emergency response. "Maybe 2 hours, possibly less, if this storm continues to intensify," Yellowhawk replied. "The rain is saturating the earthwork faster than it can drain, and the seepage is turning into actual flow in some places." It was then that Paul made his move, reaching for the gun at his belt with the smooth motion of a man who had been preparing for this moment throughout their entire reconnaissance mission. But Yiska's warrior instincts had been screaming warnings for the past hour, and he was already moving as Paul's weapon cleared leather. The two men collided in the mud beside the road, grappling for control of the gun, while Yellowhawk and Dr. Elias scattered for cover behind nearby rocks and trees. Paul was older, but desperate, fighting with the vicious intensity of a man who knew that discovery meant death or imprisonment for his role in the conspiracy. "You should have minded your own business, Indian." Paul snarled as they wrestled in the mud, his mask of friendly concern finally slipping away to reveal the greed and hatred that had been driving his actions all along. "This valley belongs to people who know how to use it properly, not savages who think corn is more important than progress." The racial slur stung, but not as much as the betrayal itself. Yiska had trusted this man, had worked beside him in the fields, had shared meals at his table, and considered him a friend. To discover that it had all been an elaborate deception was almost more painful than the physical struggle they were engaged in. The gun went off during their struggle, the bullet going wide and burying itself in a nearby tree. But the sound of the shot would certainly alert anyone within miles to their location, including the search parties that were probably already looking for them throughout the valley. Yiska finally managed to pin Paul's gun hand against the muddy ground, using his weight and leverage to keep the weapon pointed away from anyone vital. But the older farmer was far from finished. He had a knife in his other hand, and he was trying to work it up toward Yiska's ribs with the desperate strength of a cornered animal. "The mining company promised me water rights to the entire valley after the flood." Paul gasped, still struggling despite his disadvantageous position. "Exclusive irrigation contracts that would make my farm the most prosperous operation in the territory. All I had to do was provide intelligence and help create the right conditions for their plan to succeed." The knife blade scraped against Yiska's ribs, drawing blood, but not finding anything vital. In response, he brought his knee up hard into Paul's solar plexus, driving the wind out of the older man's lungs and causing him to drop the knife. "Your neighbors trusted you." Yiska said, his voice heavy with disgust and disappointment. Children trusted you, and you were planning to murder them all for money. Paul's response was cut short by the arrival of armed riders from the direction of the mining camp Pete Morrison, and at least 6 heavily armed men, all clearly prepared for serious violence. The sound of the gunshot had drawn them like wolves to wounded prey, and now Yiska and his allies were trapped in the open with nowhere to run. "Well, well," Pete called out as his men surrounded the struggling figures in the mud. "Looks like our friendly farmer finally showed his true colors. About time, Paul. I was starting to wonder if you had the stomach for this kind of work." The revelation that Pete and Paul had been working together all along explained many of the inconsistencies that had been troubling Yiska throughout their investigation. Paul's mysterious immunity to the water shortages his detailed knowledge of events throughout the valley, his eagerness to involve Sheriff Carson in their legal problems. All of it made perfect sense once you understood that he had been reporting to the mining company from the beginning. "Take them back to camp," Pete ordered his men. "The boss wants to question them before the dam goes. Find out exactly what they know and who else might be involved in their meddling." As they were bound and loaded onto horses for the ride back to Bronze Canyon, Yiska caught Dr. Elias's eye and saw his own grim determination reflected there. They had walked into a trap, but they were still alive, which meant they still had a chance to warn Cora and the other valley residents about the approaching disaster. The question was whether that chance would be enough to save anyone, or whether they would all die together in the flood that was now less than 2 hours away from devastating everything they had worked to protect. The mining camp was a hive of frantic activity when they arrived, with men loading wagons and preparing for evacuation, while others put the finishing touches on the sabotage that would bring down the dam. Yiska was hauled into the same headquarters tent, where he had overheard the conspirators planning their mass murder, and found himself face to face with the man who had been orchestrating the entire scheme. English mining supervisor James Weatherby was a small, precise man in his 50s, with the kind of cold intelligence that made him far more dangerous than men like Pete Morrison, who relied primarily on violence to achieve their goals. He studied Yiska with the dispassionate interest of a scientist examining an interesting specimen, showing neither hatred nor respect for his captive. "Mr. Yiska," Weatherby said in his cultured accent, consulting a file of papers that apparently contained detailed information about every resident of the Snake River Valley. 30 years old, Shoshone married to Ayanna Crow Feather until her death in 1878. Currently serving as a mediator between indigenous communities and white settlers in territorial land disputes. The casual mention of his dead wife hit Yiska like a physical blow, confirming that the mining company's intelligence network had penetrated every aspect of life in the valley. They knew about his personal losses, his professional relationships, and probably his emotional vulnerabilities as well. "You've been remarkably persistent in your interference with our legitimate business activities." Weatherby continued his tone, suggesting mild annoyance rather than serious concern. "But I'm afraid your noble efforts to protect your adopted community have been doomed from the beginning. Too many people have too much to gain from our success for your resistance to accomplish anything meaningful, including Paul Hendricks." Yiska set his voice, carrying all the contempt he felt for the man who had betrayed his neighbor's trust. "Ah, yes, Mr. Hendricks." Weatherby smiled thinly. "A perfect example of the kind of pragmatic cooperation that makes our work so much easier. When we approached him 3 years ago, he was facing bankruptcy due to successive crop failures and accumulating debts. We offered him a simple choice: work with us and prosper, or resist and lose everything he had spent his life building. The explanation made Paul's betrayal even more bitter. He hadn't been motivated by simple greed, but by the desperate fear of losing everything he had worked for. The mining company had identified his vulnerability and exploited it with the same cold calculation they applied to every aspect of their operation. What he didn't realize, Weatherby continued, was that our ultimate plan required the elimination of all potential witnesses to our activities, including cooperative witnesses who might become liabilities once federal investigators arrived to examine the aftermath of the disaster. The implication was clear: Paul Hendricks was as doomed as everyone else in the valley, despite his cooperation with the conspiracy. The mining company had no intention of honoring their promises to him once their plan was complete, and his farm would be swept away by the same flood that destroyed his neighbor's properties. Nor. Where is Cora Whitfield? Yiska asked, knowing that her survival was crucial, not just for personal reasons, but because she possessed the documentary evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy to federal authorities. Miss Whitfield is being held in a secure location where she can do no further damage to our interests. Weatherby replied evasively. She will, of course, be among the tragic casualties of the natural disaster that is about to unfold. The sound of splintering timber and rushing water that suddenly filled the tent announced that the dam had reached the point of no return. Whether by design or natural acceleration, the massive earthen structure was beginning its final collapse, and nothing could stop the millions of gallons of contaminated water from roaring down the Snake River Valley toward the unsuspecting communities below. "Gentlemen," Weatherby said to his assembled subordinates, "it appears that nature has decided to accelerate our timeline. Begin the final evacuation procedures immediately. We need to be well clear of the flood zone before the water reaches the valley floor." But even as he spoke, there was something in his expression that suggested the early collapse of the dam was not entirely unwelcome. The accelerated timeline would make it even more difficult for anyone to organize effective resistance or evacuation efforts, and the appearance of natural disaster would be more convincing if the collapse appeared to be driven by the storm rather than human sabotage. As the conspirators began their evacuation, Yiska and his companions were left under guard in the headquarters tent, while Pete Morrison and several of his men prepared to eliminate them as potential witnesses. But the chaos created by the early dam failure provided exactly the kind of distraction that desperate men could exploit if they were willing to risk everything on a single desperate gamble. The guards were nervous and distracted, more concerned with the approaching flood than with watching their prisoners. When a section of the dam gave way with a tremendous roar that shook the entire canyon, they turned to look toward the source of the sound, and Yiska made his move. The carved bone handle of his grandfather's war knife had been pressing against his ribs throughout his captivity, but his captors had somehow missed it during their search. Now it slid into his hand, with the familiar weight of a weapon that had served his family through countless battles, and he used it to cut through his bonds with quick, efficient strokes. Yellow Hawk and Dr. Elias followed his lead, freeing themselves, while the guards were still distracted by the sound of the collapsing dam. But their escape from the tent only brought them face to face with the larger challenge of surviving the flood and rescuing Cora before the conspiracy could eliminate all potential witnesses to their crimes. The mining camp was in complete chaos, with men running in all directions as the sound of rushing water grew louder and more ominous. Some were trying to complete the evacuation of valuable equipment, while others were simply fleeing in panic as they realized that the flood was approaching faster than anyone had anticipated. Through the confusion, Yiska caught sight of Cora being dragged toward a wagon by two armed men, her hands bound and her mouth gagged, but her eyes still showing the fierce determination that had impressed him from their first meeting in the cornfield. She was fighting her captors despite her bonds, and when she saw him approaching through the chaos, her eyes widened with a mixture of relief and warning. The rescue attempt that followed was a brief but vicious fight in the mud and rain, with Yiska's knife finding its targets, while Yellowhawk provided covering fire from a position among the mining equipment. Elias, despite his peaceful nature, proved surprisingly effective with a mining pick that he had appropriated from the confusion around them. But their tactical victory was overshadowed by the approaching sound of the flood itself, a roar like continuous thunder that grew louder with each passing second. The dam had finally given way completely, and millions of gallons of contaminated water were now rushing down the canyon toward the Snake River Valley with the force of a liquid avalanche. "We need to get to high ground," Cora shouted as Yiska cut her bonds, her voice barely audible over the sound of approaching destruction. "But first, we need to retrieve the documents I hid. They're the only proof of what these people have done." The abandoned mine shaft, where she had concealed her evidence, was located on a hillside that should be above the flood level, but reaching it would require crossing terrain that was rapidly becoming impassable as streams turned into torrents and solid ground became treacherous mud. They made the journey on foot, leading commandeered horses when the footing became too dangerous for mounted travel. Behind them, the sound of the flood grew closer and more terrifying, accompanied by the screams of men who had not moved quickly enough to escape the water's reach. The mining camp itself was being swept away by the torrent, taking with it most of the physical evidence of the conspiracy, along with anyone who had been too slow or too greedy to evacuate in time. Inside the mine shaft, Cora led them to a hidden chamber where she had concealed a leather portfolio containing hundreds of pages of contracts correspondence and detailed plans that laid out the entire conspiracy in damning detail. The documents included not only evidence of the land fraud scheme, but also the names of territorial officials who had been bribed, federal authorities who had been deceived, and mining company executives who had ordered the environmental sabotage. "This is enough to bring down the entire network," Dr. Elias said as he examined the papers by lamplight, his medical training having taught him to appreciate the importance of thorough documentation. Contracts, financial records, even letters, minutes, and shorthand notes where they discussed the planned murder of Valley residents. But their moment of triumph was interrupted by the sound of approaching voices as Pete Morrison and a small group of surviving conspirators made one final desperate attempt to eliminate the witnesses and evidence that could destroy them. The men who had made it out of the mining camp were soaked and exhausted, but they were still armed and still dangerous. "You've cost us everything," Pete screamed as he appeared at the mouth of the mine shaft, his face twisted with rage and desperation. 20 years of planning, millions of dollars in investment, all destroyed by meddling fools who couldn't mind their own business. The final confrontation that followed was brief but decisive. Pete had his gun drawn and was advancing into the mine shaft when the sound of the approaching flood became a roar that filled the entire canyon. The water had reached the base of their hill, and anyone still in the valley below was about to be swept away by forces beyond human control. In the confusion of that moment, with the sound of destruction filling their ears and the knowledge that death was rushing toward them at the speed of falling water, Pete Morrison made his last desperate play for survival and revenge. He raised his gun toward Yiska, but the sound of shifting rock above them warned of a more immediate danger. The mine shaft itself was beginning to collapse under the pressure of the flood and the vibration of falling water hitting solid rock. Ancient timbers that had supported the tunnel for decades were beginning to give way, and anyone still inside would be buried alive if they didn't escape immediately. Yiska tackled Cora and rolled with her toward the mine entrance, protecting her with his body as rocks and debris began falling around them. Yellow Hawk and Dr. Elias followed, but Pete Morrison was caught by a falling beam that pinned him in the collapsing tunnel. His screams followed them as they escaped into the storm, but there was no time for rescue attempts or mercy for enemies. The flood had reached the base of their hill, and they had perhaps minutes to reach higher ground before the water claimed them as well. The climb to safety was a nightmare of loose rock driving rain, and the constant sound of destruction below them as the Snake River Valley was reshaped by forces that no human planning could control or predict. When they finally reached a plateau that was clearly above the flood level, they turned to watch the devastation that was unfolding in the darkness below. The controlled flood that Yiska had hoped to create by clearing the spillway had become exactly the kind of catastrophic disaster that the conspirators had planned, but accelerated by natural forces beyond anyone's ability to predict or control. The water was moving faster and carrying more debris than anyone had anticipated sweeping away. Not just buildings and crops, but entire sections of the landscape itself. Diamond Creek, Cora whispered, staring toward the lights that marked their community's location. "We have to warn them." But even as she spoke, they could see that the warning was too late. The flood had reached Diamond Creek just as the first light of dawn was breaking over the valley, and the town was being systematically destroyed by water and debris that had been building momentum for miles upstream. The race down the hillside toward the town was a desperate attempt to save whoever they could from the disaster that was now beyond anyone's ability to prevent or control. They found survivors clinging to rooftops and trees, people who had been caught off guard by the speed and ferocity of the flood, but had managed to find temporary refuge above the rising water. Yellowhawk proved invaluable during the rescue efforts, using his knowledge of the terrain and his natural athletic ability to reach people who would otherwise have been beyond help. Dr. Elias established a temporary medical station on high ground, treating injuries and exposure, while Yiska and Cora coordinated the evacuation of survivors to areas that were clearly above the flood level. But their rescue efforts were complicated by the appearance of Sheriff Carson and the surviving members of his conspiracy men, who were more concerned with eliminating witnesses than with saving lives. The final confrontation between the forces of justice and corruption played out against the backdrop of natural disaster, with the sound of rushing water providing a constant reminder of the stakes involved. Sheriff Carson had his gun drawn and was advancing toward Cora when the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of federal authorities who had been dispatched to investigate reports of irregularities in the territorial administration of land rights. The federal marshal who led the investigation team was a man with the kind of no-nonsense competence that came from years of dealing with frontier corruption and violence. "Sheriff Carson." The marshal called out his voice, carrying the authority of the federal government. "You're under arrest for conspiracy fraud and accessory to mass murder. Drop your weapon and surrender immediately." The subsequent legal proceedings would eventually expose the full scope of the mining company's conspiracy and result in criminal prosecutions that extended all the way to territorial officials in Boise City and corporate executives in London. But for the immediate survivors of the flood, the most important result was the restoration of legitimate law enforcement and the beginning of recovery efforts that would eventually rebuild their community on stronger foundations. 3 weeks after the flood, as Diamond Creek began its slow recovery under federal supervision, Yiska found himself standing in the location where this entire adventure had begun. The cornfield was gone, washed away by the flood, but Paul and Ruth Hendricks were making plans for spring planting with support from the territorial government's Disaster Relief Fund. Ruth had survived the flood and the discovery of her husband's betrayal, though the knowledge that Paul had been willing to sacrifice their neighbors for personal gain had aged her visibly. She was staying with relatives in Boise City while federal investigators completed their examination of Paul's role in the conspiracy. But she had returned to supervise the cleanup of what remained of their farm. "He wasn't always like that," she said quietly as they worked together to clear flood debris from what would become next year's planting area. The Paul that I married 40 years ago would never have considered betraying his neighbors for money. But the lean years, the crop failures, the constant worry about losing everything, it changed him in ways I didn't recognize until it was too late. Cora was there too, wearing a simple but well-made dress, purchased with compensation money she had received for her role in exposing the conspiracy. Her transformation from desperate vagrant to respected community member was complete, and she had been offered positions with both the territorial government and the federal investigation team that was pursuing similar cases throughout the West. Thinking about taking the job with the federal investigators, Yiska asked as they worked together to clear flood debris from what would become next year's planting area. "I am," she replied, her voice carrying new confidence and purpose. "They need people who understand how these conspiracies work from the inside, and I want to make sure no other community goes through what we experienced here." She paused in her work and looked at him directly with the same measuring gaze that had characterized their first encounter in the cornfield. "What about you? Will you stay in Diamond Creek, or do you have other plans?" The question carried weight that went far beyond simple curiosity about his future intentions. Their relationship had evolved from desperate strangers sharing corn to trusted partners in survival, and both of them understood that their next decisions would determine whether that partnership could grow into something deeper and more permanent. "The territorial governor has offered me a position as a special investigator," Yiska said, choosing his words with the care that important conversations deserved. "Working with federal authorities to identify and prevent similar conspiracies throughout the region. Good pay, important work, and the opportunity to protect other communities from what we've faced here." "That sounds like exactly the kind of work you're suited for," she said, then hesitated before continuing with obvious determination. "Would there be room in such a life for a partner, someone who could work alongside you and share both the dangers and the rewards of that kind of service?" The question hung between them, weighted with all the experiences they had shared and the feelings that had grown from mutual respect into something approaching love. In a region where racial boundaries were complex and constantly evolving, their relationship would face challenges that went beyond the ordinary difficulties of frontier life. But it would also represent the kind of cooperation and understanding that could heal old wounds and build new foundations for the future. "There would be," Yiska said, reaching for her hands with his own, and feeling the calluses that marked her as someone who worked with her hands and understood the value of honest labor. "If that partner was someone I trusted completely, someone who had proved herself under the worst possible circumstances and come through with courage and integrity intact." Cora smiled, the expression transforming her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful in the way that came from inner strength rather than superficial features. "Then I accept, assuming you're asking what I think you're asking. I'm asking if you'll marry me," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of absolute commitment. "According to both Shoshone and territorial law, with the full understanding that our children will inherit both traditions and face challenges that come from bridging two worlds that haven't always been at peace with each other." "Yes," she said, stepping closer until they were nearly touching, her voice strong and certain despite the magnitude of what they were committing to. "Yes to all of it, the work, the dangers, the future we'll build together." As the sun set over the Snake River Valley, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson that reflected off the receding flood waters, they sealed their commitment with their first kiss, gentle, respectful, and full of promise, for the future they would create together through shared work and mutual devotion. The embrace lasted only a moment, appropriate for the time and place and the eyes that might be watching. But it carried the weight of absolute commitment and the promise of deeper intimacy that would come with marriage and the building of a home together. "When?" she asked as they stepped apart, her practical nature asserting itself even in this moment of romantic commitment. "Spring," he replied, understanding that the timing would allow them to complete their current obligations while giving the community time to recover from the recent crisis. After the planting is done and the new crops are established, we'll have a ceremony that honors both traditions and celebrates the kind of cooperation that made our survival possible. 6 months later, as spring brought new growth to the Snake River Valley, their wedding was celebrated by both communities in a ceremony that represented far more than the union of two individuals. Shoshone and white settlers came together in recognition that some bonds were stronger than the artificial divisions that had separated them for too long, and that cooperation based on mutual respect could overcome challenges that would destroy communities torn apart by prejudice and fear. The cornfield was replanted that spring, not as separate plots belonging to different groups, but as a truly communal garden that would feed everyone according to their contribution and need. At its center, where Yiska and Cora had first met in circumstances that had seemed hopeless at the time, they planted a single apple tree, a symbol of growth patience and the faith that what they had built together would endure for generations yet to come. Their work with the Federal Investigation Service took them throughout the West over the following years, exposing similar conspiracies and protecting other communities from the kind of corporate predation that had nearly destroyed Diamond Creek. But they always returned to the Snake River Valley for planting and harvest seasons, maintaining their connection to the community that had shaped them and the land that had tested them. Their children, 3 sons and 2 daughters born over the next decade, grew up bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable in Shoshone lodges and territorial schoolhouses, learning from both traditions, and prepared to build bridges between communities that their parents' generation had barely begun to construct. They carried their parents' names with pride and their mixed heritage as a source of strength rather than division. The apple tree they had planted grew tall and strong, its branches eventually providing shade for other couples who came to the spot where 2 desperate people had once shared corn and discovered that survival was possible even when everything seemed lost. Its fruit fed not only their own family, but anyone in the community who was hungry, continuing the tradition of sharing that had begun with a handful of grain offered in trust to a stranger. Years later, when federal investigators studying the case would ask Yiska what had made their resistance to the conspiracy successful, when similar efforts had failed in other communities, he would point to that apple tree and explain that survival was never just about individual courage or even tactical advantages. It was about understanding that we were all part of the same community. He would say his grandfather's knife still at his belt, but now serving as a tool for peaceful purposes rather than warfare. Red and white farmer and merchant, young and old, we all depended on the same water, the same soil, the same seasons. When we learned to protect those things together, instead of fighting each other over them, we became strong enough to defeat people who thought they could destroy us for profit. But he would also add, with the wisdom that came from surviving both betrayal and natural disaster, that vigilance was the price of freedom, and that the willingness to trust had to be balanced with the ability to recognize when trust was being abused. Paul Hendricks taught us that good people can make terrible choices when they're frightened and desperate. He would explain, the lesson isn't to stop trusting people, but to build communities strong enough that desperation doesn't drive neighbors to betray each other. The lesson was simple but profound, and it would influence federal policy toward indigenous communities and corporate regulation for decades to come. But for Yiska and Cora, walking hand in hand through the corn rows on an autumn evening 20 years after their first meeting, and the real victory was much more personal and infinitely more precious. They had found each other in the midst of conspiracy and disaster, built a marriage that bridged 2 worlds, raised children who would carry their values into the future, and created a community where differences were sources of strength rather than division. It was, they both agreed, a harvest worth all the struggles it had required, including the painful lesson that trust had to be earned anew by each generation, and that the price of freedom was eternal vigilance against those who would exploit desperation for their own gain.